What if there was a 60-second assessment you could do each morning with no special equipment that would essentially let you see how your body is responding to various stressors and changes to daily habits? Things like sleep, alcohol intake, exercise, and more. Interestingly, we found one. And the insights anyone can garner from this info, it can be a game changer in our lives, regardless of whether we're focusing on athletic, executive responsibilities, career pursuits, you name it. Welcome to the Catalyst 360 podcast, your trusted resource for engaging, evidence-based health, wellness, and performance insights. I'm your host, Dr. Brad Cooper, co-founder of the Catalyst Coaching Institute, and today's guest is Dr. Marco Altini, one of the world's foremost experts in something called HRV, or heart rate variability. Dr. Altini holds a PhD in data science and a pair of master's degrees in computer science engineering and human movement science. He also, and this is why we invited him, is the creator of a powerful app called HRV, the number 4 training, that has been fully validated for its accuracy. If you've been a listener here for long, you've heard several guests note the intrigue around this concept of HRV. 2 guests specifically, with no sponsorship connections, identified Dr. Altini's tool as the tool of choice, and he was very kind to accept our invitation to dig into the details as our guest. A brief note about today's format. The first portion of our discussion will focus on HRV and the value it brings to overall health, wellness, and performance. We'll then spend the back half of the discussion focusing on how to use it to enhance athletic performance, along with a few specific questions about the app itself, some deeper layer stuff. So whether you're curious about application to everyday life or you want to dig into the fitness and the app details, we'll cover it here. If you've been thinking about pursuing your coach certification, either as a career change, an entrepreneurial business on the side, or maybe you're a clinician looking to bolster your toolbox and your resume, we are just over 6 weeks away from the launch of the MBHWC approved coach certification cohort kickoff for 2023. If you'd like to discuss your specific situation, how it might fit in your life, your career, please reach out anytime. Results at catalystcoachinginstitute.com, and we'll set up a time to connect. Or you can tap into additional resources on the website, catalystcoachinginstitute.com. Now it's time to pull back the curtain on how to measure various stressors of life and what to do with that info with Dr. Marco Altini on the latest episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Marco, let's just lead in with describing what is HRV. We've had other guests on the show in the past that have talked about it. Listeners love this concept. Things have changed, and we'll talk about how your app has helped with that. But what is it? Like, what are we even talking about?
Yeah, for sure. So when we talk about HRV, technically speaking, we talk about how the heart does not beat at a constant frequency. There is always some variation between consecutive heartbeats. So if we know that your heart rate is 60 beats per minute, there is not a single beat exactly after 1 second and then another second and so on. You always have a bit of variability between beats. And what we quantify over a certain period of time, typically 1-2 minutes or a bit longer, is this variability between consecutive beats. Why do we care about this, right? So there is this variation, but the whole point is that this variation is not random. This variation is in large part due to the activity of the autonomic nervous system, which is responding, among other things, to the stressors that we face. So as we measure HRV, we indirectly measure the activity of the autonomic nervous system in response to stress. And this allows us, with these simple, non-invasive measurements, to get an insight into the body's physiological response to stress. Typically, that means that if we have a stressor, the activity of the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system is reduced, and that will reduce also heart rate variability. So when we face stress, our heart rate becomes more constant. Our variability is therefore reduced. When we are more relaxed, more rested, is the other way around. So our heart rate variability tends to be higher. And that's basically the insight that we get with this non-invasive measurement to try to capture the stress response.
So let me review a couple of things there. You said heart rate is more constant when we're stressed, but it's constant at a higher baseline. Is that correct? So if, let's say, your heart rate is typically 50, when you're stressed, sick, traveling, some of the other things we'll talk about in a few minutes, your heart rate. So folks, we're not talking about HRV now. So HRV is heart rate variability, the variation between the beats. But the heart rate itself, which a lot of people have historically focused on, is going to be higher under stress, but more constant. Am I hearing you correctly?
That is correct. So when you face a stressor, the autonomic nervous system will impact both your heart rate and your variability in a way that your heart rate could be slightly higher and your variability is reduced. Now, typically, we focus on HRV more than heart rate, even though both are important. And that is because HRV becomes more sensitive to these stressors that we face. So if we have a certain stressor and the parasympathetic nervous system activity is suppressed, then it will result in a slightly higher heart rate, but this change might be very small unless the stressor is huge. So unless we are sick, for example, for smaller stressors that still matter, psychological stressors, but also training stressors, sort of other things that we manage during our daily life, HRV will become more sensitive of these changes, meaning that there will be a larger change in HRV in response to the stress with respect to the change in heart rate. So that makes it easier to capture the stress response using HRV because it is more sensitive. There is a larger change. We can see it better in that data with respect to resting heart rate when we are looking at the effect of the various stressors that you also mentioned and traveling and those sort of things.
So let's talk about the not non-athletes, but folks that's not their primary focus. So the single dad who's working long hours to try to get through things, the mom who's covering 85 things at the same time, the executive who never leaves the office. How can the HRV measurements, tracking, monitoring help that person? Or even the student who's in the midst of finals week or that's approaching? How can the non-athletic focused person benefit from tracking their HRV?
Yeah, that's a great question and great examples because we always talk about HRV in sports context, but it shouldn't even be that way, right? Because everybody is experiencing stress.
Yeah.
And HRV is really not specific of anything. So it is not something that changes because you train. It just changes because you face stressors. So any stressor that, be school exams or psychological stressors, issues in the family, issues at work, all sorts of things that will basically show up in the data in a way that you could use the data to better manage when possible the stressors that you're facing, because the idea is the same as in exercise. You might try to balance better stressors to avoid, for example, things like overtraining. In work, it is the same. You try to better balance stressors to avoid burnout or other situations in which you basically have a negative chronic stress response that leads to all sorts of health issues as well that we are familiar with in modern society. So this is why tracking these kind of parameters can give us some insights on how we are responding to the various stresses that we face. And sometimes it can be easier to make changes. Sometimes it can be more complex, right? One of the reasons why I think that this is a lot used in sports is not only because that's typically the kind of person that maybe is highly motivated in tracking the data and looking at the data and trying to make adjustments, but also because it is easy to make adjustments, right? If something is off, I just have to push a workout, right? But then if I'm going through divorce or something like that, I cannot just basically shut that down or off and then just not think about that. So it can be much more difficult to make meaningful changes. And that's, I think, something where still you can work with the data in the longer term, maybe less acutely, not on a day-to-day basis, because probably you have changes that are slower, but still trying to use the data to get back into the right place with small steps in the right direction.
Well, but I'm thinking it could even be, and I want to get into, would it pick up the minor stuff, but I could see it being hugely valuable if, let's stay with the executive for a minute. I'm going into budget season. I normally work a 10-hour day. I start working 12, 14, 15-hour days. If I'm measuring that while I'm going through this quarterly or annual transition, it's a trigger to say, okay, Brad, this is higher. And so the other things we know influence it: sleep, alcohol, my workouts. I'm going to reduce my workout intensity. It seems like it could be a way to balance those things out, where it brings it to your attention and says, Coop, you're in trouble if you don't adjust something, because you can't affect your work right now, but you have these other options. You could skip the drink. You could get that extra 30 minutes sleep. You could reduce your number of intervals. Would that be effective? It's not going to maybe make up for it, because a 14-hour day is a 14-hour day, but could it be a balancing system, almost like the body
For sure.
does that itself?
It's all about balancing stressors eventually, right? And all stressors will pile up. It's not that you can isolate one or the other. So eventually we feel all of those. And the important thing is also to remember, I think, is that this is not just about the stressor and the stimulus. So it's really about how you respond to that. So there could be instances in which that is also why it is interesting and useful to measure, right? So it's given a stressor, you do not know the output, how you will respond. It could be that for you in that specific phase, it is fine to maybe work a few extra hours, and maybe you are in the right zone with your work and your kind of things, and you do not see a suppression. And in that case, you know that it's fine to do what you're doing. But then maybe in another instance, it is another version of you, right? Maybe before you had been sick, or maybe you were traveling more, or maybe there is something else that causes your response to be different to that workload. And then you can try to balance those stressors differently. As you were saying, basically making some changes to all the other things around it, because still you have to do that. Maybe that is something that you cannot adjust, but then all stressors accumulate, so that in that way you can try to better balance them.
Obviously, coaches are using this a lot with their athletes, and you're very tied into that, and you've provided a great tool for that. Again, you've got my brain going all these different directions. Are you hearing of executive coaches that are using this? So if you're coaching XYZ CFO, are you familiar with some of those folks utilizing that as a feedback mechanism to say, hey, Sally, you know what? Clearly your HRV is up. You're not telling me everything here. What else is going on?
Yeah, for sure. So we take care of the technology on our end, but we work with many, I would say, clients that do not work in sports and exercise, just because there's an overall market of stress. And then they have clients that just want to manage stress a bit differently or a bit better. And typically this can be the roles you mentioned, but I would say all sorts of people, sometimes even just maybe people that are going through health problems or chronic conditions, because we need to pace ourselves differently in those cases and to learn what we can do, what are the best days, what are the less good days, and even different conditions that maybe are not the ones we normally think about. And typically, again, in chronic conditions, still you will have better days and worse days. And this would be a tool that allows you to capture your body's response and to adjust also how you perceive your feel. And then basically this awareness piece can be enhanced.
I mean, yeah, again, you got my brain flying here. Even like accountability part, like I could see, I've had accountability partners at certain times during my life where just a buddy and I will share, here's where I'm struggling, here's what I'm working through, et cetera. And I'm even thinking in that situation, you give your accountability partner access to your HRV, and he or she can then reach out and go, Coop, like what's happening over there? Are you sick? I don't know. It just seems like, I'm excited about it. And I'm also thinking there's a lot of HIPAA issues with this, so it's not going to happen. But I could just see how valuable a caring HR director, again, probably not legal, everybody, so don't be doing this. But if there was some way that a person who truly cared and was not using this as a red flag to be able to tap into their employees' ups and downs and struggles, and like that's what we want to do as leaders, is help the people that are needing that extra support or that encouragement or that, man, this is cool. So all right, so let's come back, let's reel Brad back in here. We talked about some of the influencers. I mentioned a few: stress, alcohol, travel. increased training intensity. What are we missing? Are there other things that will show a noticeable change up or down to HRV? Exercise, I know that's a big one to actually improve it over time.
Yeah, for sure. I would say also people that have a regular menstrual cycle will see changes that are, obviously quite cyclical in nature. So that is important to know as context, because you might see changes and start thinking, hey, what is happening here? What kind of stressor is causing, for example, a suppression? But that is just normal change that is happening due to the other hormonal changes that are happening in that phase. So during the second phase of the cycle, typically the luteal phase, you might have a suppression in HRV and a slightly higher resting heart rate. And that is perfectly normal, just part of the variation that you have. That is also, I think, why it's important to interpret the data in the right way, right? Maybe we can talk a bit about that later in terms of establishing what is a normal range for you and deviations from that, because if you have this extra oscillation, then your normal will also include those, so that maybe it's a bit wider because it is normal to have these fluctuations. And then when there is a stronger stressors, you will go outside that range because maybe your HRV is further suppressed because you have been stressed by something else, that training or travel or any other psychological stressor and things like that. I would say really anything can cause a change. That is the interesting part, right? Because it's very sensitive. At the same time, it is not specific. So typically, you really need the context. That is also why when we build the tools, it's really about trying to empower the individual with the ability to track this and to add the required context, questionnaires, subjective data, information about lifestyle, so that then they can use it to basically understand what is causing changes and then implement potential behavioral or lifestyle changes that would make the data either more stable over time or increase over time in terms of HRV as a sign of either better coping or reduced stress. So all sorts of things, I think, can be adjusted depending on a person's lifestyle and stresses.
Okay. Let's talk about your app. Folks, I've listened to a bunch of Marco's interviews. I've read a bunch of his stuff leading up to prepare for this. He's a scientist, not a salesman, but he's got a cool app, and it's $10. It's $10. Like, go get it. Like, seriously, people. It's called HRV, the number 4 training. And what I love about it is I've come out of other HRV focused interviews thinking, wow, this is such a great tool. And then it's such a pain to measure. Like, you got to get the cold heart rate monitor on at 6 a.m. when you get out of bed, and you're like, this is awful. And then it's just, at some point I was like, the heck with it. It's not worth it. It's not telling me anything. The HRV for training app, I'll be the sales guy here. We have no connection, by the way. There's no sponsorship here. It's so simple. You get up, you go to the bathroom, you pull your phone out, and 60 seconds later, you have your HRV. So I love that it's so functional, man. Like, thank you for doing this. Like, this is so cool. So,
thank you so much.
So what are you hearing? Like, I've heard you write about even seasonal changes. Like, is it sunshine related? What has this app opened up that you're getting data that we never got before because it was such a stinking pain in the butt to take it?
Yeah. I think this was probably the main innovation we brought a few years back, the ability to measure with the phone camera so that you don't need straps, you don't need sensors, you don't need wearables. You can just grab your phone, take a morning snapshot. It's important to try to do it in the right conditions, right? That is typically very simple. Just as you were saying, first thing in the morning, maybe you go to the bathroom if you need to go, and then sit or lie down and take your measurement. And that gives you a reliable snapshot of your resting physiology. You need to measure your physiology before you start doing other things, right? Otherwise, all the stressors will have an impact. I think you can think a bit about measuring other things that you might be used to measuring blood pressure or all sort of other physiological signals that change continuously are typically measured at rest in a reproducible context, which means simply in a way that you can do it every day, more or less in the same way. And the easiest to do that is first thing in the morning. So before you start with your day, before you have coffee or before you exercise, have breakfast or anything like that, then you take your measurement. And over time, you will start building your baseline, understand how your physiology is changing in response to the various stressors you face. And thanks to the technology, then indeed, we have been able to do a lot of different studies in which a lot of the stressors were analyzed in relation to either a much larger population or for much longer over time, because it's just so simple to measure, right? Traditionally, in HRV research, one of the biggest issues is that the measurements were so sporadic, right? You would take a measurement and then you wait a month, right? And then people do go through everything, and then you take them to the lab and you take another measure. And that, of course, given the high day-to-day variability in these parameters, is not very insightful. Even if we talk about, again, a good example is we were saying about the changes during the menstrual cycle, right? In previous research, there was a lot of inconsistencies in the finding, even because they would measure once during one phase of the cycle and once during the other phase of the cycle. And of course, we all know that there is a lot of day-to-day variability due to other stressors. So sometimes you might get the opposite relationship just with respect to the actual physiological change, just because you're not measuring at the right resolution. You just have too little data. So with the tools that we have now, HRV for training or with other wearables that you can use during the night to capture a similar physiological response, then of course we have a lot more opportunities. We can see in one of our papers that we published last year, for example, we looked at the relationship between various stressors like training and sickness and alcohol intake, and the physiological responses in a large set of people. I think about 30,000 people, 9 million measurements of HRV over a period of 5 years. So it's a lot of individual data. Also, each person had at least 1 year of data. So you can look also at the same stressor multiple times over time. So you can start to see, how is this person responding to this particular stressor? How is this part of the population responding to this particular stressor? For example, we saw that the relationship between training and HRV and training and heart rate also changes with age, meaning that when you look at your HRV after higher intensity exercise, for any age group, you had the same response. So you would see that basically it is useful for everyone, because when you're 20 or when you're 50 or 60, you see still the suppression after higher intensity exercise with basically the same degree of change with respect to the previous day at any age. On the other hand, when looking at resting heart rate, we saw that this change was lower and lower and lower as we age, meaning that when you're young, even heart rate is able to capture reasonably well the stress response. But as you were aging, then heart rate was more or less constant. And then there was basically a much smaller or even no change in response to higher intensity exercise. So we can start looking at all sorts of different aspects just because it is much easier to take these measurements on a large population and to do that longitudinally every day, also at a very small cost. So it is easier to study different populations and those sort of things.
So maybe you've already done this, but one of the things I noticed, I'm really pulling the curtain back on Brad's life here, but I would be fascinated to know if with alcohol intake, before using HRV for training and after, is it different? Because I tell you, man, I know it's just for me. No one else is seeing my data. Maybe you are, but no one else is seeing my data. But I don't want to put that I drank alcohol last night tomorrow. So I'll tell you, there have been multiple times. I've been using your app for about 4 months now. Multiple times. I mean, like dozens of times. I'll usually have 3 or 4 not glasses of wine. 3 or 4 nights a week, I'll have a glass of wine with dinner. And I've noticed that's down to like 1 day a week because I don't want to mark that. I don't want to had a little. Have you done any surveys like that of just the accountability
I've
piece?
heard this a lot. Yes. I think a lot of people stopped drinking almost or reduced it a lot because of the same reason. Like it just makes you more aware both of the change, but even without the change in physiology, just the fact that you have to annotate to yourself that, okay, yesterday I was drinking, and then you see your data with all these wine glasses on top. It basically, a lot of people basically started, drinking less. And it's not something we look into or analyze, but I've heard it a lot.
That's interesting.
That's a good thing. Good.
That's a good thing. Exactly. Absolutely. All right. Let's talk a little bit about illness. Can the HRV? So I remember the NBA was using the Oura Ring when they were in the bubble a couple of years ago, thinking they could detect some physiological changes that would indicate the person might be positive before the COVID test actually showed a positive response. COVID aside, everyone's tired of talking COVID, but just illness in general. Are there things that checking this on a daily basis will potentially, not everyone, but potentially show some signs something is coming before we feel it coming?
Yeah, I think, let's say that you will certainly see it when you have it. Can you anticipate it? It depends.
Okay.
I think this is challenging to validate also because in studies, it is extremely difficult to determine when you got sick.
What was the actual?
Exactly, because there are many different approaches, but none is perfect. Because, for example, we could use an actual test. If we think about COVID or something, you can check. But then when you do the test, it's not really when you got sick or when you even had symptoms. And then if we look at symptoms, then we might want to look at a cluster of symptoms, because maybe a single symptom will just give you a lot of situations in which you're not actually sick. So it's difficult to even just frame the problem in a way that can systematically be analyzed with respect to the data you see. But I think in situations in which your body is already fighting the infection, but you are maybe not feeling it yet, it can happen that you haven't developed other strong symptoms, and then you might see it a day earlier. So you might see a suppression already, and then maybe during the day you start not feeling great, and that just gives you an insight into what is happening, and then you can take action in a way that might be simply, okay, I'm not going to meet the people I wanted to meet, and things like that, which can help. And even outside of that, I would say, even if you feel it, then seeing the data is just confirmatory evidence, let's say, that that is something that is happening. So you don't even have the doubt. You're not like, hey, I don't feel great, but let's still do what I had planned to do, because then you also see that maybe your heart rate is elevated, your HRV is suppressed. So maybe in a condition like the bubble or other situations in which you are actively trying to avoid spreading it, then you would take action and just maybe isolate or something like that. Okay. So it can be effective that way, but I would say in a very short term, maybe just before or together with symptoms of that.
So there's an old saying with at least runners, potentially endurance athletes of all sorts, that if it's above the neck, you keep running. If it's below, basically a chest cold, you take some time off. Any similar rule? I know with the HRV app, if you mark I'm sick, it just immediately makes you yellow and says, chill, you just said you're sick. What if that there's a lot of respiratory stuff here in the U.S. at least, just hanging on for weeks, and like 6 weeks, 5 weeks. At what point, and you're not a doctor, you're not a medical doctor, any recommendations of how to treat that data as you're just sitting on that plateau forever?
Yeah, so I think it depends a bit. Let's put it this way. The data might be helpful because it would be typically highly suppressed just in the very acute phase. So if you just then, keep having a bit of running nose or something like that for 2 weeks, your data is likely very normal. It does not show that anymore. So in the very acute phase where maybe you had a bit of fever or not even, but something was off. It just happened to me actually, like 2 days ago. I was, started having a running nose and maybe a little cough, but I feel okay. Like I work and I went for an easy run, but the data was suppressed. And then today was suppressed again, but maybe I'm a bit better. And then typically after a day or two like this, if I feel good and, there is no really sickness developing, then the data will renormalize in a way that you might just have still some symptoms and things that might take some time, but it will it will not show that much of a strong change in the data. So obviously, with all the required disclaimers, I think the data might be helpful in a way that it allows you to track a bit better the recovery process in a way that sometimes is difficult because, sure, feel is important and we need to understand, how we're feeling and what is happening. But some of these things, as you say, could be continuing for some time and there might be no problem, or the other way around. We might feel better, but still the body is still physiologically very stressed. Something is really off. So we need to pay attention because if heart rate keeps staying elevated for several days, weeks, the HRV is suppressed, then clearly we are dealing with something else. And then we need to pay attention to that because if we keep adding stressors and doing high intensity exercise and things like that, then might just delay even further the recovery process.
So if I'm hearing you right, okay, I'm feeling still a little sick, but my HRV is back in my normal range or even on the higher end of that, and my heart rate has come back to that normal range. Again, same disclaimers, this is not medical advice, but generally speaking, would that be the time where you'd say, okay, you can probably lean back into your traditional training because, yeah, you're still feeling it, that chest thing's hanging on, or you got the sniffles or whatever, but your HRV's back, your heart rate's back, your body's responding well outside of that one symptom that you've got.
Yeah. I would say so. It would point that direction that your physiology is renormalizing. Yeah.
Okay. And then just to clarify for everyone, just so we're making sure, HRV generally higher is better, but there are exceptions to that. You don't want to be outside of your normal range. Is that correct? So after you've recorded this for a couple of weeks, it's going to give you a range, everybody. And higher's better, but, and can you explain to us that but?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is really important and typically ignored by most tools out there, right? You use an HRV tool and the naive interpretation is always the same. It's higher is better. So the higher you are, the better scores it will give you and things like that. But when we talk about physiology, it doesn't really work that way. So think about normally the way I put this so that people understand it a bit better is just to relate it to other signals as well that we might know better in this context. For example, if you think about blood pressure, you know that very high or very low is not particularly good, but then there is this normal range. And for blood pressure, we have these normal ranges that should work for everyone, even though we know that probably that is not really the case.
Sure.
But for HRV, it is the same idea, but then the normal range is not something generic. It is built from your data because it's specific and individual to you. Now, another way to look at this is if we think about exercise heart rate, we know that if we get fitter over a period of time, our heart rate will reduce at the same intensity because we are more fit. Now, if this happens over months, that's great. But if my heart rate today is very low with respect to my normal when I'm exercising, that does not mean that I am suddenly extremely fit. It is typically a sign, right? It is typically just a sign. Sorry, guys. It's just a sign of fatigue. And that is similar with HRV and resting heart rate. So if we have a very high HRV on a given day and a very low heart rate, typically that means, and I mean outside of our normal range, typically that means that there might be, again, excessive fatigue or that the body is very parasympathetic, not because we are ready to take a lot of stress, but because it's busy dealing with the previous stress so that it's trying to renormalize basically, and likely the day after everything will be back to normal. Now that's important to understand that there is this normal range that is specific to us and that changes over time, right? So this normal range in our tools, for example, are continuously updated because your normal in summer is different from your normal in winter, right? There are other reasons that basically cause HRV to change in the very long term that we don't notice on a day-to-day basis, but we cannot keep the frame of reference constant over time. We need to adjust it as we go through life, basically, and then we are able to appreciate these deviations on a day-to-day basis based on the different stressors that we face.
And you just mentioned winter, summer, variation, what's happening there? And have we peeled out the other variables? For example, it now doesn't get light in Colorado until 6:30 or so. And so I might be delaying my workouts to another time, maybe a lunchtime workout or something. Or someone else might not get out for a morning walk because they need to get to work now in the sunshine. Maybe they're walking in the dark. Are those, if we peel the exercise changes out, is it sunshine related? Like, what are we hypothesizing is causing that seasonal change, or do we know? Are we beyond that?
Yeah, I don't think we do. I think these changes have been documented recently through the use of wearables and other devices that are allowed to measure for so long in a way that could be captured more consistently. There are changes due to the circadian rhythm simply, right? So the cycle of day and night and how your physiology changes in that context. And then, over seasons, we know that HRV tends to be a bit higher in summer and a bit lower in winter. But this is not always so obvious either, right? Because all the other stressors also have a role. And it's not that this seasonal change is much more marked than other changes that might be going on through other stressors, right? For example, I have many years of data, and sometimes I can see some of this change. In other cases, I cannot because maybe other stressors, psychological stressors or other sort of things, had a much greater impact on my resting physiology. Another one could be seasonal allergies, right? Maybe in spring, typically, a lot of people experience some drops. That happens to me also a lot. The first heat, right? Again, spring, beginning of summer, when the temperatures go really high, some of us deal with it more poorly, right? So maybe summer is good in general, and the light and the longer days and this kind of things. But the change to the higher temperature causes first a suppression and an issue in adapting to that stressor, a bit like when we go at altitude, right? So heat and altitude both acutely can cause a suppression, but then if we adapt to the stimulus, then we might bounce back to values that were even higher than before facing that specific stressor.
All right, very good. Let's lean into the exercise stuff now. So first of all, I know it's not specific to HRV, but we'll come back to that connection. Polarized training. It is the rage now. Joe Friel's got his 5.2. Alan Cousins is out. He's been doing that for years. But talk to the listeners through what in the heck is polarized training, and why do you think it's getting so much attention in recent years, besides the fact that it works?
I think one of the maybe most confusing parts first is how we define it even, right? So there are different definitions of it. The way I look at it is maybe a bit different from the way others talk about it, which means that for me, it's the whole idea of that was maybe popularized also in the various books that Matt Fitzgerald wrote about the 80-20 in running and in triathlon. So the idea of the 80-20 or the polarized training, interpreted this way, is that a lot of your training is low intensity, let's say the 80%. And the other 20% is higher intensity. And higher intensity means anything. It does not mean, in this case, that you look only at the top end, because some versions of polarized training is often put, let's say, it's always considered as something different from what others call pyramidal training, where you still have the same base of easy training, but then instead of having this very high intensity part, you have more of the moderate intensity and then a little of the higher intensity. So to me, this is sort of a false dichotomy, because for me, everything is a subset of polarized, because polarized just means a lot of easy and the rest is hard. And moderate for me is hard, because anything that is above easy is hard. It just cannot be, there is hard and there is less hard, but it doesn't matter, because for your body, it's a hard stimulus. So if I go moderate, tempo run or whatever, above my first lactate threshold or ventilatory threshold, for example, then that is a hard stimulus. So for me, that is the interpretation. There's also the interpretation that Matt gives in his books. I think it's an interpretation that tries to let's say, not argue between these two versions of doing more or less moderate or high intensity, because I think that is beyond the point. That is really something you focus on when you want to lead to certain adaptations depending on the competition you're facing. It's a more of an advanced way of thinking of planning and structuring your training. But the old point that we try to bring to the average person that maybe is unaware of these ways of training and is always going out at the same intensity is that that is not beneficial. Going out always at the same intensity, which typically ends up being moderate intensity, does not lead to the same progress that you would make if you were slowing down, allowing your body to basically better assimilate that low intensity stimulus. And then as you do that, basically build also more volume because you are less fatigued, both from a central and autonomic nervous system and muscular fatigue. Basically, everything that you're using in your runs is less fatigue because you're going easy, and that allows you to go harder and do proper workouts in the other sessions, which can lead to great improvements in performance at any level.
And how does tracking our HRV help with the way that we're implementing the polarized concept, regardless of whether we're following process A or process B, the concept is itself?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great question because we need to tie in this way of measuring our physiological response with the way we are training. And I always say that HRV is useful once you have a plan, right? You do not use HRV to replace your plan. You start with a plan, which could be a polarized plan in which you try to go easy most of your time and then do sessions the other 20% of your time. And then once you have this structure, you use HRV to make adjustments. So if today was the day that you were supposed to do a hard session, but your HRV is suppressed because of other stressors, then it is a good idea to switch that. And that day, maybe you keep doing an easy session. And then the day after, when everything is renormalized, you do your hard session. And this is based on the very simple principle we were discussing earlier that all stress piles up and accumulates. So we cannot just keep adding stress and expect a positive response. We just risk basically to dig a hole to ourselves and then never be able to get out of that and get into negative chronic adaptations and things like that because we are not balancing stressors the right way. So by using HRV in conjunction with your training plan, then you can make changes that allow basically your body to better to face the other stressors when you are more ready to assimilate that stressor because your physiology is not impaired, and that in the longer run will lead to better performance as well.
I'll ask this and feel free to say, there's just too many different ways of looking at it, but can you help the listener who says, okay, I'm hearing about zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Can you help them with some percentages? Is it 60 to 70, 50 to 60? Like, where is zone 1? And I know different people have different definitions. There's different calculations. The 220 minus the age we know is not going to give you anything that's of value. But, and the HRV for training does an auto calculation for you. But and does it matter from your impression of the difference between zone 1 and zone 2 training, or is the concept just stay 2 or below?
So I'd say different things here. One is that these percentages are always a bit difficult because depending on your history, your thresholds might be in different places with respect to your maximal heart rate. But still, when we do not have access to a lab, this is the best we've got, right? Perceived effort and all of that, I think it takes time to develop that. So sometimes you cannot tell someone, okay, your perceived exertion should be 3 out of 10 and expect that out completely. Of the blue, they will be able to, to follow that. I see also my own case. I've learned this over years. Like I had absolutely no idea. For years, I trained moderate just because I had absolutely no idea. And then, I started looking at heart rate. At the beginning, when you're unfit, I think you can use maybe a slightly higher percentage simply because it will go up very quickly. So it will be, in any case, a very slow run and maybe with some walking here and there. But using something like 75, 77%, of your maximal heart rate. That's what I did at the beginning. Your maximal heart rate, ideally, you know that, or you can find out with maybe a hard run, if you're healthy, maybe on a hill, a couple of repetitions on a hill typically get your heart rate very high. You take that value and then take a percentage of that, like 75, 77%. And then you would say that that's your upper end zone 2. So for me, when I started, for example, my maximal heart rate was, I think, 187. Then by doing the math, it came to maybe 147, 148 as my upper end zone 2. At that moment, you basically don't have an aerobic base. You're not fit for this. So as soon as you start moving, you hit that value, which means that most of your runs will tend to be closer to them. But ideally, you want to really cover a broader range. You want to go slower. You want to try to cover, there is really no marker between zone 1 and 2. It's a bit made up. But still, the goal for me there would be that you really need to try to cover a broader range and not just to try to stay very near the threshold. Also because thresholds are just made up numbers, right? We should not forget that the threshold should guide you a bit. But if you always stay exactly there, you might just always go moderate again, because maybe your threshold is slightly lower and you're always going at that intensity. So that is also not helpful. So my recommendation would be to try to find your maximal heart rate, get a percentage of that, start running at that intensity or cycling at that intensity, and then try it over your easy workouts to cover a broader range. So stay a bit slower than that, a bit easier than that. And that should, over a couple of weeks or months, lead to your heart rate at that intensity become lower. So basically you become faster at the same heart rate because your body is adapting to that and improving aerobically. And that will allow you also maybe to add a little volume if that's what you want to do. So go a bit more frequently or a bit longer. And then also to do the other part of your training, the harder sessions, well rested because you were going low intensity during those sessions.
Yeah. So using your example of your top of zone 2 is 145, what you're saying is don't just sit at 142, 143, 144 on all your runs, except for the high intensity ones. Do some at 120 to 125, do some at that 140, 145, and then go all in. But the goal in your mind at this point, the way you're applying it at least, is it's not a matter of just stay below the top of zone 2. It's create a range. Get it to where literally you're doing some in 1, some in 2, and then some in 4 and 5.
Exactly. Try to cover all ranges. I'm of the idea that there is nothing you should necessarily avoid. Obviously, some will be more stressful, and that's why we do it less frequently. And others, you will just benefit from it, especially if we keep it very low intensity and controlled.
Okay.
And it will get better over time, right? So now I go a lot with, maybe 120 beats, and before it was impossible to keep that intensity basically without walking, right?
Yeah. I hear you. I'm experiencing the same. All right. So one of the interesting features in the app is the acute and chronic training load. How would you recommend using this? Are there some sweet spots depending on if you're in the build phase, maintenance phase, race prep phase? If I understand it right, the acute is based on your load the last week, and then the chronic is more, the last month, 45 days, something like that?
Yeah, exactly. About 6 weeks. Yeah.
And how do you choose the right trigger for that? Because your app provides a bunch of options around intensity, duration, time, distance, that kind of thing. If you're not using Training Peaks, if you're not using some of these other tools, and you literally have your Strava upload and your own HRV entry point and the way you put in quality and RPE and all that kind of stuff, which one do you pick? Like, what should people be utilizing on that?
It's a very good question. So the training impulse, basically, which is used to build all of these graphs, should be something that is meaningful to your sport and the way you train. So if you're an endurance athlete, typically things like TSS in Training Peaks or relative effort in Strava, basically a combination of duration and intensity is used. Now, all of these things have their limitations. And again, we should, I think, always look at the big picture here. So when we try to build these graphs, acute and chronic training load ratio and things like that, we look at how the training that we are used to take, which is the chronic one, is going in relation to the training we've done very recently, the acute one. So I think it is, regardless of very specific thresholds also that have been proposed also here, what really matters here, big picture, is if you're used to do this much, you cannot do a lot more than that without risking something, right? Injury or anything like that. So the idea is that to pick the training impulse that is representative to you for a runner, it could even just be distance most of the time, right? If you don't do a lot of structured workouts, then distance is a good way to track what you're doing for duration. And then if you normally run 60 miles and this week you're running 100 miles, then obviously you're risking something and your acute load will be very high with respect to your chronic load. So I think that it's a good idea to keep an eye on this a bit and try to manage it in a way that your acute load does not exceed too much your chronic load over time. And then also to look at that in relation to how your body is actually responding, because these models just look at what you're doing. They look at your training. So, and then they model what's your risk based on the acute and chronic load, but they do not look at how your body has actually responded to that, which is the HRV piece. So I think that looking at both can be informative. We actually did a study on this. It was in another type of athlete. I think it was maybe in CrossFit, where we looked at together the acute and chronic ratio and the HRV. And you could see that only when the HRV was suppressed, so the HRV was low, signaling higher stress, and the acute to chronic ratio showed that the acute load was very high, then you had higher injury risk. So basically, in a situation in which your HRV is already suppressed and you increase your training load, you are at higher risk than if you were increasing your training load and your HRV was normal. Because maybe your HRV is suppressed was already signaling that there was a problem, right? That your body was maybe struggling with the stimulus or stress or other sort of things. And I think that's very insightful because you look at it from different angles, but then you can really use the data in a way that allows you also to modulate training on a weekly basis a bit differently. Yeah.
So I'm looking at the app, that section right now, the load. So for the person who is not utilizing the paid Strava, the paid Training Peaks, et cetera, would you point them to duration times RPE and then make sure they're putting in a very accurate RPE each day? The duration throws me off because, for example, if you spend an hour in the gym, that's a very different stressor than another hour of running or another hour on the bike.
Yeah.
So maybe duration's not the right one. Which one would what would you point the not super serious athlete, because they're probably paying for those things, but the athlete just below that, would you point them to one of these as a primary go-to?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the sport. So RPE can be great for sports that are more difficult to quantify. Like, as you said, the gym or CrossFit or sort of things. Even in this study, they had used RPE times duration because that way you can modulate a bit the intensity. Maybe in the gym, it's the RPE is low, and the duration is similar. If you have only one sport, it's also much easier. And this becomes more complex when you try to combine multiple sports, right? Because then it's difficult to standardize intensity across exercise types and duration. 6 hours on the bike is very different than when you do the same on the run.
Sure.
So there are limitations there. But depending on your main sport, I would try to use, let's say if you're mainly a runner, then you could even just start by looking at distance. If you're good at tracking your RPE, then you could also use RPE and duration. Okay. Typically, they tend to highly correlate between each other, all of these parameters, because still is a way for you to track the work you've been doing. But I think it's very sport specific sometimes or person specific.
It seems like distance times RPE would be most valuable for something like cycling or running or swimming if it were exclusive. But the only way to do that would be to take a double view, right? To look at it and then look at the opposite, right? You can't combine those.
Yeah, no, normally we have duration only in relation to RP, but distance and duration also tend to be highly correlated for cycling and running normally.
Okay, got it. All right, let's see. I've got to keep an eye on the time here. I appreciate you joining us here. The injury risk piece, you've talked about it a little bit. How does that tie? Like, I get the overuse in general in terms of duration, distance, et cetera. But how can it possibly pick up stress fractures and the things that tend to affect us most of all? What is your research showing with that, with the injury risk piece, outside of you're just doing too much, you just got to dial it back?
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult one. I do not think that we have the evidence to say that these kind of parameters are resting physiology and so can be spotting that specifically because of the things we talked about. Basically, it's just not specific. So very sensitive to stressors, but then all sorts of things might be driving changes. And most importantly, some of the main issues that we have as recreational or even elite athletes, things like overuse injuries and things more at the muscular level, those might not be captured very well by this kind of metrics, right? We look at the autonomic nervous system response, the stress response, but even just something as simple as muscle soreness might not really be captured here. So if you do, that's why I say you need to have a plan first, and then you make adjustments with HRV. Because if yesterday I went really hard and today my HRV is good, that is a good sign. It means that I bounce back really quickly from the intensity of the autonomic nervous system, bounce back really quickly. That is exactly what I want to see. I do not want to see a suppression after a hard session, but that does not mean go hard again. That's why you need a plan first, because I might be extremely sore and that does not show up in the data, right? So that is important to understand as a limitation, especially for athletes, because that type of impairment in what you can do on a given day, right? High muscle soreness as a different time course with respect to your response that you capture with HRV. And that's why you can use the data to make changes in response to other stressors, but then you need also to have a plan that accounts for the recovery after all sessions and all the things that we know.
Okay, good. All right, tail end here, just two quick hit and runs. Other tools, Stride, heart rate monitors, Oura Ring. Can you give us this one is not helpful, this one, and I don't know, I know you don't want to do that, so let's not ask it that way. What is, let me just hit each one. What's the value of Stride? Is that basically a treadmill tool, and otherwise it's just another data? I feel like endurance athletes, we've got so much data we're collecting, and if we'd spend a little more time actually in the gym instead of looking at data, we might have better results. But thoughts on the use of Stride? If someone's thinking about Stride or they've got a Stride unit, obviously it brings power to the concept of running. It's being enhanced on a regular basis. They have their new unit coming out in November, I believe. But at this point, where do you see the value of Stride related to HRV?
So I would say that Stride focuses a lot on the external load, right? So the work you're doing, power, energy expenditure, all of that. And that is good context for your internal load. So how your physiology is changing. So by typically looking at power and heart rate, for example, over time, you might be able to see if you're making progress, for example, with your polarized training or any sort of training that you're doing. If things are going well at the same power, you might see again a reduced heart rate. Now, for runners, often pace might be enough depending on where you live. So I do not think that you necessarily need to go into power as a recreational athlete. You can start by looking at your pace, even if you run courses with little hills. If it is often the same around your house, I think that's okay. Otherwise, power might be useful in trying to better quantify that external load at certain times. I think the company has done very good work, very good engineering work, let's say. The device can be used also for simpler things like just providing your pace and distance instead of GPS. in a way that is often a lot more accurate. So that's why, as you were saying, it can be used a lot indoor treadmills and things like that to give you very accurate data. At the same time, I use it even outside just as a replacement for the GPS in terms of accurate pace and distance. And I find that it is pretty good for that. Power is a complex topic. It cannot really be measured with running, and it's just an accelerometer, but they did really good work to estimate something that makes sense in terms of the effort you're making. So it could be a tool to explore maybe for someone that is already a bit more advanced.
Okay, very good. Let's talk Oura Ring, and then I want to ask you about the treadmill. We had an offline conversation that might be helpful to other folks. So just real quickly, value of the Oura Ring with this, is that just another option? Does it bring anything additional to the things that you're tracking, et cetera?
Yeah, I would say so here I'm an advisor at Oura as well, so just full disclosure, but I think it's a good device regardless to track these parameters in the night. So morning and night measurements are two good alternatives to track physiological stress. We said before, you need a reproducible context, something that you do every day more or less in the same way. That could be as soon as you wake up, or it could be when you're sleeping. The two data points typically are highly correlated, which means that you can track the same stress responses. So typically, I leave it up to individual preference. Some people like to have the wearables. Some people just prefer not to have them, or maybe there is also costs involved and all of that, and prefer to just measure in the morning. I think both of them are valid. There is also a temperature sensor, which I think can be nice in the ring as an extra. But in terms of resting physiology, it's the same. So up to individual preference, whatever they prefer.
And then finally, the treadmill. Treadmills are, when we're trying to track it through a GPS, it's inherently off. Garmin allows you to adjust it. I'm sure Polar and others do as well. But when it's translated through Strava and then over the HRV, do we just say it's just not going to be accurate between December and April and just go with that? Or are there some workarounds that we can actually get some data that translates to the HRV for training that wouldn't mess up the algorithm?
Yeah, I would say if the data is not good as input, it can be problematic.
Yeah.
But if we are able to get accurate pace through a stride or something like that, that should allow algorithms that then use your workouts data to estimate heart rate threshold or VO2 max and things like that to work similarly to what we get outside. Conditions also change. Environmental conditions, temperature, humidity will also have an impact. So all of those factors will matter in the way that your heart rate also changes. I think we always need to remember this context. It could be that you're able to track how your physiology is changing over that period of time that you train on the treadmill. And then maybe when you get outside and then it's another season, then you will look again at relative changes more than the absolute difference between these two phases.
Right. So essentially Stride or one of the Wahoo-like treadmills that allows more accurate, at this point, is the primary option.
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay. And then I just want to see your crystal ball. Like, as we look forward, again, you can tell I'm so excited about your tool and the way I think it's changing the way we're measuring this that we couldn't when we had our first HRV guest on probably 4 years ago. What do you see coming in the HRV world? Where is it going? Is it going to be something that triathletes have as they're going down the road at Kona that they're monitoring every second? Are there ways we're going to pull it into the executive suite we were talking about, or students on a regular basis with their student counselor? Like, where do you see this going?
So I think that the use of the technology can only be more widespread because there are more and more ways to track it, and they are accurate. So the technology has improved a lot. The wearables are pretty good right now. So that is pretty good, and it's changed dramatically in the past 5 years, I would say, not even 10. It's been really a recent change. What I think is missing now is, in many cases, a better understanding of how we influence it, right? What can you do to make a meaningful change, right? What kind of practices can lead to better outcomes? And I think measuring is the first step. But then now we can have a lot more studies in which different things are tried or experimented on. at the individual level to see how you can maybe impact your physiology. Because right now we do a lot of measuring and maybe little changes, or when we do changes, we have no idea what is going to happen. So I think that is going to be an interesting area to follow in the next maybe 10 years.
So many opportunities. My PhD focused on something called functional mental toughness. And I wish I would have known about this at the time. We tried to measure different physiological responses and then what was their mental toughness measurement in the offshoots of that. And now I'm wondering, have you looked at your correlations already connect with sleep and movement, obviously. We talk a lot about the 4 catalyst cornerstones of move, fuel, rest, and connect. I wonder, have you talked at all internally about adding a subjective 1 to 10 rating of how am I fueling? Was it almost like the alcohol? Did I eat terrible, decent, dialed in, kind of like you do with alcohol, none, little, lot. Have you talked about doing something like that with fuel or with connections, relationships? If my relationship with Susanna is on the rocks, if I'm struggling, if I think she's mad at me, like the rest of my life it's not right. That certainly affects my HRV. Have you looked at the other 2 pieces of connect and fueling as some sort of feedback mechanism?
That's super important indeed. So in the software, I think we have the option to basically add custom tags, we call them, so that you can track some extra parameters that maybe are particularly relevant for you, or even though in this case, I think they're relevant obviously to everyone. So that could be a way to keep track of these other aspects. And then the app will allow you also to run correlations using the custom tags so that you can see all these links to your physiology.
Got it.
Those are all very good and valid points. I think those are aspects that are certainly key to physiological changes, both in terms of fueling and relationships and socializing, and all of that extremely important.
Yeah. Dr. Altini, this was awesome. Thanks for doing this. I know it's a different time zone. We're trying to coordinate this across the world, but great job, great insights, and thanks for creating this. It's making a big difference out there.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
I first learned about HRV when I was presenting at a conference in Northern Ireland several years ago. At the time, I was fascinated, but an accurate, readily available means of tracking it just wasn't there. It's exciting to see that has changed so dramatically since that time. Thank you again to Dr. Marco Altini for joining us here on the podcast and for the important work he's doing to make this more accessible. Thanks to you for tuning into the #1 podcast for health and wellness coaching. If you're thinking to yourself, wait, the Catalyst 360 podcast, is that a new name? Nice job. After 240 plus episodes and recognition as being in the top 1.5% of all podcasts, we decided it was a great time for a great new name, and Catalyst 360 rose to the top. If you're looking for 360-degree health, wellness, performance insights for you, your coaching clients, or others, we've got you covered right here. Next week's episode, speaking of which, is an absolute must if you're a current or potentially future health and wellness coach. Leanne Webster, Executive Director of the National Board for Health and Wellness Coaching, will be joining us to provide the latest updates on the industry, changes to the profession, and tips for success as we move forward. As always, feel free to reach out to us with any questions about your current or future coaching career, or if you're an employer and you're looking to avoid continuing to check the box and try to help your employees actually fill that box, you can reach out to us. Results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com, or you can tap into additional resources on the website, catalystcoachinginstitute.com. Now, it's time to be that catalyst. This is Dr. Brad Cooper of the Catalyst Coaching Institute. I'll speak with you soon on another episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.